You don't have standards, you have preferences. You say you have standards. You say you know what you will and won't tolerate. You say you've learned from past situations. You say you've grown. But then something happens. Not something dramatic, something small. A moment where one of those standards gets tested, they cancel last minute, they become inconsistent, they say something that doesn't sit right, they shift their behavior, and instead of holding the line, you adjust. You explain it, you give it more time. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. And in that moment, what you call a standard turns into a preference. Because a standard doesn't change when it's inconvenient. A preference does. Standards sound strong until they get tested. Before you're in the situation, everything feels clear. You know what you expect. You know what you won't accept. You can say it confidently, you can list it out, you can explain it. But none of that matters until it's tested in real time. Because standards are not defined by what you say when things are easy. They're defined by what you enforce when something challenges them. And most people don't realize this. They think having a standard means thinking a certain way. It doesn't. It means acting a certain way when it becomes uncomfortable. And that's where the gap appears. Not in what you believe, in what you do when it matters. You don't break your standards all at once. It doesn't happen in a big, obvious moment. It happens gradually. Small adjustments, small allowances, small compromises that feel reasonable in the moment. You don't say, I'm abandoning my standards. You say, this situation is different. You say, I just need to understand them better. You say, I don't want to overreact. And each one of those thoughts feels justified. But what you're actually doing is creating exceptions. And once exceptions exist, the standard weakens. Not because it's wrong, because it's no longer consistent. And inconsistency is what turns something firm into something flexible. You confuse flexibility with maturity. You think adjusting makes you mature. You think being understanding makes you emotionally intelligent. You think giving things time makes you patient. And sometimes it does. But not when it overrides something that already felt off. Because real maturity is not about tolerating everything. It's about recognizing when something doesn't align and responding accordingly. But that response requires discomfort. It requires you to hold a position even when it creates tension. And most people don't do that. They remove the tension instead. They soften their stance. They reduce the friction. And in doing that, they tell themselves they're being reasonable, when in reality, they're avoiding the discomfort of enforcement. You negotiate with yourself in real time. This is where it actually happens, not externally, internally. The moment something doesn't feel right, you don't act. You negotiate. You start running through explanations. You search for reasons to stay. You try to balance what you feel with what you want. And the longer that negotiation continues, the weaker your position becomes. Because you're no longer deciding based on clarity. You're deciding based on comfort. You're trying to find a version of the situation that allows you to stay without feeling like you're compromising. And that version doesn't exist, but you keep looking for it anyway. This is why nothing changes. And you've seen this before, not once, multiple times, different people, different situations, same pattern. You say what you want, you feel something off, you hesitate to act, you adjust instead. And then later, it becomes clear. And when it becomes clear, it feels obvious. It feels like something you should have acted on earlier. But you did see it earlier, you just didn't enforce it. That's why nothing changes. Not because you don't know better, because you don't act on what you know when it first matters. Standards require action, not agreement. You can agree with a standard all day, you can believe in it, you can talk about it, you can explain it to other people. But none of that makes it real. It becomes real when you act on it, when you enforce it, when you make a decision that reflects it. And that decision usually comes with a cost: discomfort, uncertainty, potential loss. That's why most people don't follow through, not because they don't understand, because they don't want to deal with the immediate consequence of holding the line. You prioritize short-term comfort over long-term alignment. Every time you override a standard, you're choosing comfort. You're choosing the version of the situation that feels easier in the moment. You're choosing to avoid the friction that comes with enforcing it. And that works short-term. It reduces tension. It keeps things stable. It allows you to stay where you are, but long-term, it creates misalignment. Because now your behavior no longer matches what you say you value. And when those two things separate, confusion starts to build. Not because the situation is unclear, because your response to it is inconsistent. This is why you don't trust yourself. Trust is built through consistency. When you say something and follow through, trust increases. When you say something and override it, trust decreases. And most people don't realize how often they're breaking that pattern. They think self-trust is something you feel. It's not. It's something you build through repeated action. And if your actions don't match your standards, your system starts to recognize that. It starts to expect inconsistency. It starts to assume that what you say won't hold under pressure. And that's when doubt appears. Not because you're incapable, because your behavior has taught you not to rely on yourself. You don't need better standards, you need enforcement. The problem isn't that your standards are too low, it's that they're not enforced. You already know what doesn't work for you. You've already experienced it. You've already recognized the patterns. But recognition without enforcement doesn't change anything. It just makes you more aware of the gap. And the longer that gap exists, the more frustrating it becomes. Because now you're not just dealing with the situation. You're dealing with the fact that you're not acting on what you already know. Enforcement feels like loss at first. This is the part most people avoid. When you actually enforce a standard, it doesn't feel empowering immediately. It feels uncomfortable. It feels like you're losing something. It feels like you're walking away from potential, from possibility, from something that could have worked. And that feeling is what causes hesitation, because your mind starts focusing on what you're giving up instead of what you're protecting. But that discomfort is temporary. What lasts is the alignment. What lasts is the clarity. What lasts is the consistency between what you say and what you do. This is where the shift happens. The shift is simple, not easy, but simple. You stop negotiating. You stop explaining. You stop creating exceptions. You decide that what you've already identified as misaligned is not something you're going to continue participating in. And you act on that decision earlier, not after it becomes undeniable, not after it repeats multiple times. At the first clear signal, that's the difference. Not better awareness, faster enforcement. This is the real difference. You don't have a standards problem. You have an enforcement problem. You already know what doesn't work. You've seen it, you've felt it, you've experienced it multiple times. The issue is not recognition, it's response. Because every time you choose not to act, you reinforce the idea that your standards are optional. And the moment that changes, everything changes. Because now your behavior matches your values. Now your decisions reflect your awareness. Now your standards are no longer preferences. They're something real. Thank you for watching. This is MindStickz.